Today's reading is from The Essential Writings of Merleau Ponty. This is Phenomenology and Psychoanalysis. Preface to Esnard's L'œuvre de Freud. Dr. Esnard has generously asked that a philosopher be present at the beginning of this book, in which we may hear speaking 40 years of experience, reading, reflection, and research into the thought of Freud. Certainly it is not for a philosopher to judge this long and militant process of thought. But, thinks Dr. Esnard, the theory and practice of psychoanalysis presume or induce an attitude of mind, and even, all unknown to Freud, a new philosophy. As a worldview, psychoanalysis converges with other efforts, including phenomenology. Dr. Esnard approves of those who take care, as I did in an early work, Phenomenology of Perception, to separate psychoanalysis from a scientistic or objectivist ideology, which considers the Freudian unconscious as an archaic or primordial consciousness, the repressed as a zone of experience that we have not integrated, the body as a sort of natural or innate complex, and communication as a relation between incarnate beings of this sort who are well or badly integrated. Here, phenomenology brings to psychoanalysis certain categories, certain means of expression that it needs in order to complete itself. Phenomenology permits psychoanalysis to recognize psychic reality without equivocation, the intrasubjective essence of morbid formations, the fantastic operation that reconstructs a world on the margin of and counter to the true world, a lived history beneath the effective history, a world called illness. Freudian thought, in turn, confirms phenomenology in its description of a consciousness that is not so much knowledge or representation as investment. It brings to phenomenology a wealth of concrete examples that add weight to what it has been able to say in general of the relations of man with the world and of the interhuman bond. Phenomenology and psychoanalysis, in mutual encounter, would lead us toward a philosophy delivered from the interaction between substances, toward a humanism of truth without metaphysics. It is concerning this encounter that I have been called upon to testify. I do this with great pleasure, persuaded as I am that philosophy is concrete, and that psychoanalysis is informed with a thought which nevertheless is expressed only very indirectly in certain Freudian concepts. Does not the notion of libido lose all its meaning if there is a cellular libido, if it is a property of the cells, and the notion of repression its effectiveness, if it only exists as mnemic traces, or as unconscious representations? Again, does not the notion of libido lose all its meaning if there is a cellular libido, if it is a property of the cells, and the notion of repression its effectiveness, if only it exists as mnemic traces or as unconscious representations? For the physician or the therapist, this rudimentary image is not so dangerous. The contact with patients and with illness always brings a surplus of meaning, of weight, of density to the meager concepts of the theory. But since psychoanalysis is also an ideology that is talked of and that is becoming an element of our culture, it cannot content itself with concepts that are simply good enough for working in vivo. It must formulate the treasure of experience that is hidden in psychoanalytic communication, and that until now has been reserved for the initiates. Freud's genius is obviously not that of philosophical or exhaustive expression. It resides rather in his contact with things, his polymorphous perception of work, of acts, of dreams, of their flux and their reflux, of counter-coups, of echoes, of substitutions, of metamorphoses. Freud is sovereign in this listening to the confused noises of a life. However, however long we have had a world, a literature, and fathers, we had to wait for Freud's teaching to discover that in becoming a father, a man can also become the child he was, place himself in another role under the Oedipian constellation, and discovers himself as father, with imaginable consequences for the couple, especially if, as frequently happens, the wife concurrently relates the paternity of the child she brings into the world to her own father. This prodigious intuition of exchanges of roles, exchange of the soul and the body, of the imaginary and the real, this universal promiscuity, Freud has sometimes described in a language made to order, overdetermination, complexes, instances, but he also frequently simply makes allusions using terms from the medicine and psychologies of his time, projections, traces, representations. This leads to misunderstandings between Freud and the hurried reader, perhaps between Freud and himself. The sexuality that is the buttress or nerve of human relations is confused with the sexuality that is the function of the organism, an objective process. The Oedipus complex is spoken of as a cause, while actually it only imposes on the child certain poles, a system of references and dimensions, the child's position, or his successive positions, in this context being a matter of individual history. Every reader of Freud, I imagine, remembers his first impressions, an incredible bias in favor of the least probable interpretations, a maniacal penchant for the sexual, and above all, the basis of their archaic forms, signification, language, and action obscured in the interest of derisive puns. Then, to the extent that one read, that one related oneself to oneself, and that the years passed, a sort of evidence for psychoanalysis was inexplicably established, and one came to live in peace with this pitiless hermeneutic. The adversaries of psychoanalysis commented that, once the barriers between good and evil are broken, a victim does not even feel his abjection. The psychoanalysts said that certain resistances had been disarmed. It was neither exactly the one nor the other. It was not that virtue had allowed itself to be tempted by vice, or bad faith by sincerity. There really was a misunderstanding, and it has been lifted. The psychoanalysis that we accept and like is not the one that we refused. We refused, as we always will, to grant to that phallus which is part of the objective body, the organ of micturation and copulation, such power of causality over so many forms of behavior. What we learned from all the material drawn from dreams, fantasies, and behaviors, and finally even in our own dreaming about the body, was to discern an imaginary phallus, a symbolic phallus, oniric and poetic. It is not the useful, functional, prosaic body which explains man. On the contrary, it is the human body which rediscovers its symbolic or poetic weight. We refused, and always will, to see behind the dream, the humorous word, the failed act, so absurd a multiplication of associations. What we have now understood is that symbolic matrices, a language of self to self, systems of equivalences built up by the past, effect groupings, abbreviations, and distortions in a simple act in which analysis reconstitutes more and more closely. Freud never says any of this in these terms, but what is the good of allowing the misunderstandings to endure and willingly prolonging the scandal of psychoanalysis? These reasons for reformulating certain Freudian concepts in the framework of a better philosophy still seem true to me. However, a philosophy that is now perhaps more mature, and also the growth of Freudian research, precisely precisely in the direction taken by Dr. Hesnard, would today lead me to express in a different way relations of phenomenology and psychoanalysis, the implicit philosophy of psychoanalysis itself, and in the long run would make me less indulgent than Dr. Hesnard generously is toward my earlier attempts. The more that one penetrates phenomenological thought, and the more familiar one becomes with Husserl's enterprise, thanks to the publication of his hitherto unpublished works, the better one can distinguish phenomenology from the new philosophy of consciousness, which it took itself to be at first. A superficial reading of Ideas 1 could lead one to believe that, no matter what happens, philosophy will never have anything to describe but the transparent correlations between acts of thought and objects of thought, that it is a system of apprehensions and pure significations immersed in experience, but which imposes its style and its mode of functioning on the natural and human world. Nevertheless, given this infinite curiosity, this ambition to see everything which animates the phenomenological reduction, what then is the hidden being that it seeks to surprise? As Husserl proceeded to the execution of his program, he brought to light fragments of being which disconcerted his frame of reference. Neither the body, which is subject-object, nor the passage of interior time, which is not a system of acts of consciousness, nor the other person, who is born by previous deduction from me or by expansion of me, as Eve is born from the side of Adam, nor history, which is my life in others and the life of others in me, which is in principle an inexact object like other persons, none of these allow themselves to be brought together under the correlation of consciousness and its objects, of the noesis and the noema. Philosophy ceases to be an exact knowledge, a pure regard on pure objects. It is, as Husserl, what is sought by the successive generations of philosophers, and no one philosopher coincides with the intentional interiority that they all invoke, and that as a group they constitute. All consciousness is consciousness of something or of the world, but this something, this world, is no longer, as phenomenological positivism appeared to teach, an object that is what it is, exactly adjusted to acts of consciousness. Consciousness is now the soul of Heraclitus, and being, which is around it rather than in front of it, is a being of dreams, by definition hidden. Husserl sometimes uses the term pre-being. This phenomenology, which descends into its own substratum, is converging more than ever with Freudian research. To stop with intentionality as a relation of ideal objects would now seem to me disloyal to philosophy. Phenomenological idealism is insufficient. Furthermore, the idealistic formulation is a threat to the Freudian heritage, perhaps the gravest danger menacing it today. Biologism and objectivism reign no longer. Phenomenology, so to speak, has succeeded too well. There is no longer any great risk, that Freudian research will shock us by recalling what there is of the barbarian in us. The risk is rather that its findings will be too easily accepted in an idealist form. Dr. Hesnard shows in one of his chapters that today there is a race toward psychoanalysis, just as there once was a flight from it. Yesterday it was the spirit of evil. Today one trims its claws and one adopts it. This is not to understand it better. When we see what can happen to a civilization in which psychoanalysis is too well tolerated, in which psychoanalytic concepts, weakened and banalized, have lost their enigmas and furnish the themes of a new dogmatism, in which the doctrine, learned in elementary school and having become an institution, fashions mentalities that resemble it too much, that seem to verify it, but that actually mask, precisely under an accelerated and superficial analysis, an unconscious of the second degree. When we see all this, we must ask ourselves as therapy and as we must ask ourselves whether it is not essential to psychoanalysis, for its existence as therapy and as verifiable knowledge, to remain not exactly a disreputable enterprise or a secret science, but at least a paradox and an interrogation. It is psychoanalysis that has unveiled the Oedipian infrastructure of science, of technology, and of accidental understanding. It is psychoanalysis that has returned our myths to us. What will become of all this if the tamed sphinx soberly takes its place in a new philosophy of enlightenment? Thus, there is an idealist deviation of Freudian research along the objectivist deviation, and perhaps they are not so opposed as that. When Dr. Lacan writes that the phenomenology of hallucination, to the extent that it attempts to be rigorous, goes beyond the limits of a philosophy of consciousness, he is retracing the steps of a phenomenology which is deepening itself. On the other hand, when Freud writes that, at the time of the analytic cure, the meaning that the patient ends up by finding in his history should rejoin the mnemic traces, or when he implies in his analyses a summary conception of the sensorium as the functioning of an objective apparatus, this is neither satisfying nor philosophically comprehensible. These mechanistic and energic metaphors do of course protect, as against every idealization, the threshold of an intuition that is one of the most precious of Freudian thought, that of our archaeology. The best parry to the two dangers we are speaking about would perhaps be to learn to read Freud the way we read a classic, that is, by understanding his words and theoretical concepts, not in their lexical and common meaning, but in the meaning they acquire from within the experience which they announce, and of which we have behind our backs much more than a suspicion. Since our philosophy has given us no better way to express the intemporal, that indestructible element in us, which, says Freud, is the unconscious itself, perhaps we should continue calling it the unconscious, so long as we do not forget that the word is the index of an enigma, because the term retains, like an algae or the stone that one drags up, something of the sea from which it was taken. The accord of phenomenology and of psychoanalysis should not be understood to consist in phenomenology saying clearly what psychoanalysis has said obscurely. On the contrary, it is by what phenomenology implies or unveils as its limits, by its latent content or its unconscious, that it is in consonance with psychoanalysis. Thus the cross-validation between the two doctrines is not exactly on the subject man. Their agreement is precisely, rather, in describing man as a timber yard, in order to discover, beyond the truth of immanence, that of the ego and its acts, that of consciousness and its objects, of relations which consciousness cannot sustain, man's relations to his origins and his relations to his models. Freud points his finger at the id and the superego. Husserl, in his last writings, speaks of historical life as a Tiefenleben, a deep life. Phenomenology and psychoanalysis are not parallel. Much better, they are both aiming toward the same latency. This is how I would define the relationship today if I had to take up the question again, not to attenuate what I said before, but on the contrary, to make it more serious. In this way, I think I rejoin Dr. Hesnard's own conceptions. He who understands illness as the constitution of a world on the borders of the other certainly thinks that man could not thus pass over the true world if it were positively given, or recognizable according to criteria. Thus these pages only bring new motives for subscribing to the rapprochement which Dr. Hesnard proposes, and I would like in writing to have them and I would like in writing them to have merited a little better the very courteous invitation which he addressed to me.